too far from view. I wasn't gazing at the open sky. Now I'm searching for the hero inside, 'cause he's soaring through the air, and it's really quite amazing. Every eye turned up, their hearts he's elevating.
Greetings and welcome all to the DCEU and Me, a limited event series podcast, hosted by yours truly, Byron Lafayette, as well as Josh Mesker and Curry Morris. The goal of this podcast is to be a reflective look at the DCEU in its entirety, the good, bad, and in between. We will explore the iconic characters, stories, and competing egos that fought over this universe and eventually doomed it. This limited event series will cover all the films within the DCEU, with a special yet-to-be-announced bonus film episode that will be announced near the end, as well as possibly talking to some special guests along the way. We are aiming for this series to be the definitive podcast review series on the DCEU, so sit back and relax and enjoy this nostalgic look back at the DC Extended Universe. So, how are you guys doing?
Doing great. Glad to be here, man. Thanks for having us.
Mm-hmm.
Great to be here, and I don't know if the world is ready for 3 Snyder fans taking on the DCEU and sharing all of our opinions as we go along, but it's too late for that now. We're all in, so I guess they're just gonna have to live with it.
The die has already been cast.
That's the perfect segue into my little jingle I came up with this podcast. Imagine DCE.
Hit it, Curry.
Imagine DCE and you and me. How happy we could be if they just finished it. So happy with Snyder.
There's the clapping in the background
as we got on the call, just so you know.
It's gonna be a hit. It's gonna be a hit.
We need to auto tune it and like throw some kind of beat behind it.
You know, don't tempt me, because that actually might end up happening.
Please do it. You have my full permission. Verbal agreement. Go for it.
But now I'm thinking it through choreography now as a theater guy. So now it's just, this could just be the weirdest thing
Just
possible.
put like the 3 of us, Zack Snyder and like Dwayne Johnson on some else. We'll do the Elf Yourself thing, and we'll just swap out the background for like Man of Steel or whatever movie.
we send the invite to Zack Snyder, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm going to come onto that podcast." That he goes and watches the first episode. It's like to his agent, "Get me out of this."
It'll show all that. It'll show we'll hear the song, and then the tagline will be, "The hierarchy of the podcast world is about to change."
And there is truth to that, because we are going to be the the top of the mountain when it comes to DCEU podcasts. So there are quite a few of them out there, but I think ours is going to be the best, and I'm not saying that with any kind of bias at all.
We're definitely going to be the most positive.
That is for sure.
Because I'm here, and I'm a big fan of it as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the DCEU, and there's a lot of bad that comes with it, but there's also a lot of good, and there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff to talk about as well, which I guess is kind of a perfect segue, honestly. So why don't we get started, Curry, with you first, and then we'll move on to Josh. What was your experience with the DCEU? When did you first become a fan? When were you first exposed to it? Has it been from the beginning? How did that develop?
Yeah, for me, definitely from the beginning. I remember being so incredibly hyped for Man of Steel, like with all the trailers and the marketing, and like it just looked like everything I wanted a modern day Superman movie to be. Just being a fan of Superman the animated series, of reading the comics, of playing games, like all the different like interpretations I was familiar with. Like it looked like it was going to pull from that. And I'm a huge Smallville fan. And I got wind that they were going to cast a whole bunch of Smallville alum in it, which we'll get into later. So I remember when Man of Steel came out, I saw it twice opening day and 3 times opening weekend. I saw an IMAX at midnight, then went with my family later that day, and then I went again with friends on Sunday. And it was crazy. And obviously, I'm a huge fan. Man of Steel is actually one of my favorite films ever made. It's in my top 10 of all time. So I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of how it tried to be different from other superhero films coming out at the time, especially as a shared universe and just in tone and setting and thematic content. And as it kept going, it just evolved in some weird and wonderful ways, not so wonderful ways. But as a whole, I think there's some really special stuff in there. And I think Man of Steel was a great start to that.
So my path is slightly different there. Full confession up front, I've never been a huge Superman fan. I've always been, in the war between Batman and Superman, I've always been team Batman. Had a difficult time kind of relating to the Superman character. Not that I didn't think he was cool and all that. And I don't even believe I did not see Man of Steel in the theaters even, around that time, you had Star Wars kind of starting to kick back up and the MCU is going strong. But once I saw Man of Steel, I was hooked. And frankly, it was the first time for me that I could relate to Superman as a character. And not only that, but the action was great, the cinematography was great, the writing was great. Coming off of the Dark Knight trilogy, and other things that attracted me to watching it was just the fact that, Christopher Nolan was involved in the story and kind of handing off the DC reins to, in some respect to Zack Snyder. And so there was kind of some built-in trust there too. And so I saw Man of Steel and I was just blown away. And I've watched it, I don't know how many times since then. And it is absolutely my favorite interpretation of Superman. And we can get into more reasons why, but that is kind of long story short, how I came into it. I ended up watching it at home, a little while later and just absolutely loved it. And then started getting more into the DCEU. And
I had kind of a similar journey to you, Josh, because, I was never a huge Superman fan. Like, I'd seen, honestly, before Man of Steel, I had only seen bits and pieces of the previous Superman movies just because I'd not had a lot of interest, honestly. I remember I really liked the old like Superman cartoons, and stuff. Those were fun. But just overall, I never really related to the character. I just was never, really that excited. But I remember when I first saw the trailer for Man of Steel, and I was like, "Oh, this looks interesting." But I was like, "Man, Superman punching someone?" It was very, very interesting, and it was enough for me to think, "Oh, I'm going to go and see this in theaters." And then after I saw it, I was like, man, this was awesome. This was really, really cool. And I became like a fan. And then, of course, when you mentioned the BVS trailer that got put up onto YouTube after Comic-Con, I just remember how stoked I was with that, that shot of Batman in the rain, with Superman hovering above. I was like, oh man. And I was like, man, Batman, he just looks so angry. It's like
that is still one of my all-time favorite trailers.
Mm-hmm.
And the Comic-Con Suicide Squad trailer as well, the early one.
Speaking of trailers for Man of Steel, one of you mentioned it. The very first trailer where they did one with Jonathan Kent's narration and one with Russell Crowe's or Jor-El's narration, where he's like, they're talking about like they will race behind you, they will stumble, they will fall, with him like running around as a kid with the cape, with like the beautiful B-roll and the freaking Bridge of Khazad-dûm music from Lord of the Rings where Gandalf dies. And then it ends with that shot of him flying. I was like, you could not have married more perfect things together for me. And I just remember like tearing up when I saw it. Was like, oh my gosh, it's happening. Like, it killed me. I was so excited.
It is so true. And, it was just, it was incredible how everything came together, to create that. And before we kind of start talking a little bit about the movie itself and our experiences and what we liked, there's actually kind of an interesting development history of Man of Steel that leads up to its release that I'm sure a lot of people know, but some might not know, that actually begins, that we would not have Man of Steel as we know it without Bryan Singer's Superman Returns. Because actually Man of Steel, some people might not know, was actually first created, I guess you could say, as a sequel to Superman Returns. That's where the title came from, Man of Steel. We actually had a little bit of a case of how Ben Affleck's The Batman turned into Matt Reeves' The Batman, and that was kind of what happened with Man of Steel a bit. But the birth of Man of Steel first started out of the, shall we say, lukewarm reception to Superman Returns. That was kind of more of a complete celebration of the the original kind of 1970s Superman. It was pretty much like a backdoor sequel to that series, and it just was not very well received by audiences. And so any sequel, the Man of Steel sequel that was going to be set in that universe was scrapped, and they kind of went back to the drawing board. And you guys might find this kind of interesting, that when they were kind of developing this idea for what they were going to do with this Superman reboot, there was actually an idea kind of pitched by Morrison that was going to be similar to All-Star, which we'll come back to when we have our BVS discussion. That Mark Miller had teamed up with director Matthew Vaughn, and that they were planning what they described as an epic 8-hour Superman trilogy, with each installment releasing a year apart, that was going to be compared to the Lord of the Rings meets the Godfather trilogy. And it was going to span the entire life of Kal-El from his birth until when Earth's yellow sun was turning into a red giant. And in that particular incarnation, Daredevil's Charlie Cox was pitched as Superman. So what do you guys think about that? Had you heard about that? How would you have felt about that type of trilogy?
I had absolutely no clue. None whatsoever. Byron, you are the sleuth. And Curry is too. And but I did not know about that particular part of the story and development cycle at all.
Yeah, so I was familiar that there were a bunch of projects that tried to get off the ground, like before Superman Returns, after Superman Returns, and there was a whole bunch of people like in the running. I didn't know a lot of the details beyond like Superman Flyby and a couple other things.
Oh yeah, the Abrams. Yeah, movie. I didn't know.
I had no idea Charlie Cox was in the running. He's phenomenal as Daredevil, so that's kind of exciting. It's also kind of funny because he's in a movie with Henry Cavill called Stardust, and it's just funny that they were in that together before either of them were potentially Superman. It's ironic, small world. But that's cool to know. It's always interesting to hear like what projects never materialize, for better or worse.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would have been an extremely interesting kind of following Superman over the course of his life. And, I have a feeling probably the reason why it ended up not getting off of the ground was because Vaughn later said that the tone of the trilogy was going to be in line with Richard Donner's 1978 film. And he was going to include villains such as like Brainiac, Lex Luthor, Zod, of course. But I have a feeling probably it was that Richard Donner tone that made them not do it, because they just had that bad experience, with Superman Returns. And so they probably didn't want to go back to that so soon. But yeah, it's definitely very interesting. And you guys mentioned, of course, I think most people know about Superman Flyby with Abrams. That was going to be the Abrams produced version. There was even some talk of McGee directing it. We dodged a bullet there. But yeah, it would have been very interesting. A bunch of these different these different incarnations of it. But kind of going through all of these different ones, it led us to, the Man of Steel that we have now, which was, produced by Christopher Nolan, of course, and, the interesting thing about Man of Steel is that originally Zack Snyder was not the, I don't want to say he wasn't the first choice, but it was that he was not the original director who they were looking for, that he kind of came on a little bit later. There was a director's list that they had kind of gone through of people who they were kind of considering before they settled on Snyder and his tone and what they were going after. And so, so I'm just going to kind of go through and read the list of directors that were in the running, and then we can kind of talk about how we would have felt with the kind of tones that those people would have brought in. So, starting off at the top of the list, we have Guillermo del Toro was on that list. Robert Zemeckis, Tony Scott, Matt Reeves, Ben Affleck, Jonathan Liebsman, and Duncan Jones. What do you guys think about that list as potential directors for Man of Steel?
Del Toro's version of Krypton especially would have been cool. Of all of those, like some of them I think would have excelled in the action, some of them in the character moments, some in the tone. But so I think, that's not a terrible short list, to be honest with you. But I think when you're marrying the tone, the action, the visual style, and of course the script that no one had come up with, Snyder really was kind of the perfect blend for what they were going for comparatively to that list. Like, I see what they were aiming for in all of those, looking for someone to pull it all together. I also wonder what would have been like. I mean, I think at one time he was on the list because Christopher Nolan declined directing it to produce it. Like, what it would have been like if he did it.
Yes, definitely. Because I want to say, that I believe that Chris Nolan was the number one choice with Warner Brothers, that like coming off of the Dark Knight trilogy, they would have loved to, have kind of just continued that good times train with him directing it. And yeah, it would have been a really interesting movie. At the end of the day, I'm glad he didn't direct it, as I'm just not sure how a Superman film from him would have looked. But I think at the end of the day, the best of both worlds was him producing it and kind of having that effect. But that would have been an interesting movie, a Nolan directed Superman.
Well, I mean, I think because not only Nolan produced it, but he also has a story credit on it. Yeah. I think, frankly, that it wouldn't have been exactly the same because, both Nolan and Snyder have their distinct visual styles. But I can't help but feel like, when you go from the Dark Knight trilogy to Man of Steel, to me, even though they're in completely separate universes cinematically, they carry a similar tone to them. And I actually think that it just made total sense that WB early on, after all of that kind of chaos of trying to figure out how to do another Superman movie, they went to Nolan. He produced it. They got David S. Goyer to write the screenplay based upon Nolan's story treatment. And Goyer already had a great resume with comic book films because he was, I believe if I'm not mistaken, he wrote Blade, among others.
All three of them, I think.
Yeah. And so we won't talk about Blade Trinity, but, everybody has a stinker in their repertoire. It's not that bad, but come on, compared to like Blade 1 and 2, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, for sure.
And then Nolan, who has been a fan of Snyder and continues to this day to defend Zack Snyder, which I just really, really appreciate about Chris Nolan. He brought on board a younger up and coming director who had already done Watchmen and 300. I mean, it was just the perfect scenario. Despite that, there are many, 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 many who disagree. and in my opinion, I don't think you could have had a more perfect storm than the Nolan, Snyder, Goyer trio working on Man of Steel. I really do not think so.
I think at the time, though, it wasn't all that controversial. Like, Watchmen was pretty well received, even from a lot of purists, save a couple things that he obviously went stylistic on that they weren't a fan of. But Snyder wasn't really all that divisive until
it came out.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, which I do have thoughts on, which we can save for later. But it's because Superman is held differently from other heroes. He's in a different class, and everybody has this their own interpretation of what Superman means, which is hilarious because that's exactly what this trilogy tackles as an idea. People are like, Snyder was the wrong man. I can't believe they did the story. I'm like, Snyder didn't write it, guys. Snyder didn't write Man of Steel.
I'm reminded of the line from BVS, actually, should there be a Superman? And the response is, there is. And so how do you deal with that? And that brings us to the film itself.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Cause that is the question when we look at this particular movie and we look at how it was handled kind of leading into our discussion of it, that, it was this more mythological, look at Superman, and it was a very realistic look at Superman, that it's like, okay, we have this indestructible alien being, that lives among us. And how would the world react to that? How would his parents who raised him react to that? How would people who saw what he did, or how he helped people react to that? That there would be a lot of fear, there would be a lot of trepidation in there with seeing the results of that type of a person.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't. I'll go ahead, Curry.
I was just gonna say, and again, I know I keep saying this, I'll get more into this later, but the influences that I see in Man of Steel, which I've never seen officially documented, is like these influenced the movie. But a lot of what I see in Smallville and Superman the animated series in particular, and like the continuity of the Bruce Timm verse with Batman the animated series, Justice League, those portrayals of Superman and Clark Kent and like his upbringing and the ideology of like why he is the way he is all over this movie, but also in the sense that Superman is this ideal to strive towards, but he's not perfect, and he does make decisions that sometimes are more brutal or like more necessary, or deals with things and that maybe the Christopher Reeve version wouldn't do. And the Christopher Reeve version, I think, permeated culture so thoroughly that people had a hard time accepting something different because they'd never had to before in the big screen. The Brandon Routh Superman Returns was just a redo of Christopher Reeve. It's set in the same continuity loosely. I was all about it, but to see the divisive response that it had was like so confusing for me. And that's because it challenges the very ideas that Superman rests on. It deconstructs it so it can build it back up properly.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I remember the, kind of the controversy around the film when it came out. I was very surprised because I remember when I first saw, the movie in theaters, I of course loved it, but at the same time, like I was not that shocked by anything, and I'm sure we'll get to this, later, but like just for the example of, the killing of General Zod, I was not shocked at that at all. Like it didn't bother me it didn't bother me. I was like, oh, okay. It worked for me narratively. And then like, over the days and weeks later, when I was seeing all my friends, everyone was like, oh my gosh, he killed Zod. That's horrific. I can't believe it. I was like, wait, what's going on? Why are people upset? Like it was interesting. But I agree with you, Curry. I think that it is that Superman, especially with Reeves' version, it has permeated culture, and Superman is one of those odd characters in the sense that he hasn't had that many adaptations. Like we see so many versions of him in pop culture, but when you look at movies itself, there's not that many versions. And so it's kind of like, I can see kind of maybe how those tribes have kind of formed around those individual actors. This isn't like Batman, this isn't like Spider-Man necessarily.
No, I was just going to say on that point really quick, because it kind of gets to the crux of this whole conversation and controversy is we know that Superman tries to avoid death and killing as much as he possibly can. That's a virtue of Superman. If he can avoid it, he will. But I don't see what the problem is, especially contextually within that scene of him doing it to save the lives of an innocent family that are about to be turned into fried chicken. Okay. So I don't get, I don't get the controversy there. What, he's just going to let them die? He's just going to let these people die. I don't get and I've never seen an adequate explanation for why people are so against that scene and what occurs there other than just like an emotional response. They can't tell me contextually why it's such a problem.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Byron, do you mind if I respond to Josh there?
Absolutely,
Josh,
go for it.
The answer to that question is there isn't a good explanation. And I have like, oh gosh, I've spent so many years arguing about this movie. When you look at like Batman, especially like post-crisis, like 1980s, Dark Knight Returns and on Batman, maybe Dark Knight Returns is the best example. Batman's pretty well known for having a no-kill code, right? That's like one of his things. But what's weird is all of the movies have him killing in some way. Now, the Dark Knight trilogy kind of dodges this by like, they're very circumstantial killings or like, he's forced to, but the best example to compare the two is like when he kills Harvey Dent in The Dark Knight. He does it because he has to, and it kind of inadvertently happens to save a child. But he blows up a town of ninjas in Batman Begins. Who knows how many people die in The Dark Knight Rises when he's blowing up Batmobiles and stuff. And of course,
and you remember in Batman Begins, he tells Ra's al Ghul, "I won't kill you, but I don't have to let you live." Or something like that. It's like, okay, well, all right.
Like that's loosey goosey, but okay, it sounds cool and it was a cool moment, so I'll accept it. And then you go to the 90s films, and Michael Keaton is the Punisher, just without guns. And Val Kilmer murders in his films, but that movie actually tries to reckon with it. The only on-screen Batmans that haven't killed, like, I guess you can count Adam West, too. I'd have to go back and watch his movie to be sure. George Clooney is actually probably the friendliest Batman. And Robert Pattinson's Batman, actually, they stuck to, like, the mainstream stuff. So you take all of that, and I know this is a bit of a tangent.
And he also doesn't kill in Zack Snyder's Justice League because of the arc that he undergoes. But
right.
I don't remember. I mean, he is the embodiment of what traditionally people think of Batman in Zack Snyder's Justice League. Absolutely.
The only criticism I accept of that, not really even a criticism, more of an observation, is he does kill parademons. But parademons are a bit of another loosey-goosey thing in the mythology. In some versions, Batman directly avoids killing them because they're living like alien beings. In some, they're more like zombified lab experiments, which I think is more of what these movies were going for. So it's like a different case. But Byron, and Josh, my whole point with that is that the movies clearly go against that code that is very well known from the comics of the last 40 years. But yet culture associates Batman with no killing. However, you would have to prove to me in the source material where it's actually directly stated that Superman will never kill, because the source material actually shows otherwise. In one of the 1980s post-crisis like issues, there's like a clone of Zod and his henchmen or whatever that like end up in this like parallel dimension, and they murder every human on the planet. They basically do exactly what they said they've always do. And Superman encounters them and goes to that, and he executes them with kryptonite for their crimes. And like he's very like kind of broken over what he did, but it's a very clear like mainstream continuity thing that happens. He also he kills Doomsday in the Death of Superman because he has to. That's generally accepted. There's other instances in the Justice League animated series when Darkseid finally like crosses the line. He does this in Superman in the animated series, and he threatens him. When Darkseid invades, kills somebody he knows, he invades Apocalypse and says, "If you ever do this again, then basically I'll end you." He does it in Justice League, and he sends the whole team away, and is going to kill him. And Batman tries to stop him, and he like breaks Batman's ribs, but Batman's able to transform him away before he can do the deed. Superman is willing to do what needs to be done, but because sometimes there's an argument to be made, and I don't want to get into this. Maybe killing is the just thing. Maybe disposing of the villain, not murder. Whole different can of worms there. So then my question becomes like, okay, well, where does this understanding that Superman never kills? Superman always does the right thing. And I think that's conflated with never killing. Then I'm like, okay, is it the Reeve movies? But no, in the theatrical cut of Superman 2, it's intended in the edit that he murders Zod. Now, if you watch the extended like TV cut, it does show Zod and the other henchmen getting arrested. And in the Richard Donner cut, they end up back in the Phantom Zone. But in the original theatrical cut that most people have seen, he crushes Zod's hand and throws him off a cliff. And it's understood that Zod is dead because he never shows up again. So I'm like, well, where does this idea come from? It's because Superman, people say he's boring. He's this idea that people strive towards, like Man of Steel says, that they project this idea of like he can do nothing that would harm this other person, which is why he never punched anyone, really. He did in Superman 2 until Man of Steel. So that's a roundabout way of saying that there's no clear reasoning for why Superman is held to this standard and this code that he clearly never says, because Batman's whole kill code thing is actually supposed to be somewhat of a flaw with the Joker, and it's a repeated thematic topic that comes up.
I guess in some ways that kind of brings us, though, to, like, if we want to circle back around to kind of the beginning of the film, the destruction of Krypton, that entire sequence was just absolutely phenomenal and one of my most favorite 10 to 15 minutes of any movie ever, frankly. But we get to Earth, and the Kents find him, and we end up in this very interesting philosophical, ethical, existential discussion about who Superman is and how the Kents are trying to protect him, how they're trying to make sure that if he helps and takes on a higher purpose, that he's doing it for the right reasons. That discussion is so dense, but it's really, really important for us to talk about, because it's the discussion that so many people get wrong, in my opinion, especially through the portrayal of Pa Kent. What if we kind of started there?
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, let's dive in right there, because I agree with you. I think a lot there's so much criticism of this film for those philosophical discussions that you mentioned, and the views that Pa Kent holds, and some of those ideas that he shares, that I personally think that there's very clear explanations for, but their discussions, their ideas that we really hadn't heard before in particularly a Superman film, but also kind of a comic book film in general. It kind of went a lot deeper. So yeah, let's get started, I guess, with the kind of I think probably the one we're first thinking of, all of us together, that we can talk about is the bus incident, in Man of Steel. That it's this extremely powerful moment, where everyone who's seen the film knows, that the school bus goes over into a river. Everybody's dying, everyone's drowning, and then you have that incredible music score. Just, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. And we have young Clark pushing the bus out of the river, and then he goes back and saves the bully who'd been bullying him, and and it's a beautiful moment. And then you have the eyewitness, and the mother who goes over to Clark's house and basically says, I saw what Clark did, and she doesn't have an explanation for it. She just says it's a miracle, but the film doesn't try to get into the idea of what people necessarily think he is. They just kind of have that idea of her not sure, but she knows something happened. And then we get down to that moment where Pa Kent is talking to Clark and is basically saying, kind of almost like chastising him a little bit, of saying, we talked about this, you aren't supposed to show your powers, whatever. And then Clark says, well, what was I supposed to do? Was I supposed to let them die? And then Pa Kent says, I don't know, maybe. And oh man, that caused a firestorm with people. But yeah, let's talk about that scene and what we think and the philosophical ramifications of it.
Yeah. So if you guys don't mind if I dive in there, first off, it's cool that it's Lana Lang who is the witness, which, she's a huge character on Smallville, a huge character in Superman 3 and in the comics, Superman's true first love, his Gwen Stacy, if you will. And, Pete Ross is one of his best friends on the Smallville show. There's so many references. And they even said there's a line that says the Fordham boy saw it too. Whitney Fordham was the bully in Smallville in the first season. So there's so many references. There's like a dozen actors from the show who actually have cameos in the movie. It's really cool. It's like seeing it on the big screen. People ride Superman like really hard in this movie, like in the sense that they look for anything to complain about. That scene right before this where he steals the clothes after saving all the oil, like the oil rig guys. Like people are like, Superman would never do that. And I'm like, Clark Kent writes articles about himself and wins awards for them. And nobody ever complains about that. Like, get off his back. He was trying to hide after like saving how many countless lives. And then it goes into that. And and you started what was I supposed to do? Let them die? Jonathan Kent saying maybe, that is a tough pill to swallow. Let's be honest. That maybe is rocked with uncertainty, but it's undercut by reminding Clark of the gravity of his abilities. He's saying maybe he shouldn't let them die, but he does have to be mindful of accepting the consequences of his actions and being ready for the impact he can truly make. Because if he lets them die, it's terrible. It's this awful thing, but then he's protected. And him seeing a witness, the neighbor's response to this as a work of religious proportions, they call it providence, reinforces that whole danger. And when Clark is outed later in the movie, he's turned over, betrayed, and even fired upon by the people he's trying to protect. He fights for them anyway. And Jonathan in that moment saying maybe selfishly doesn't want his son to be taken away. So maybe means maybe you should have let them die in case they do take you away because the world isn't ready. He isn't ready. And that's an honest human answer filled with relevance, and it hits harder as a parent personally. Now, it rubs people wrong for being challenging, but it's the beginning of a philosophy that there are consequences for your actions, and you saving a bus full of kids is important. It's not that you should let them die, but by saving them, you could possibly change the world, and that could be a good thing, a bad thing, and could lead to persecution for you and so many other people. And that's exactly what happens in the next movie.
Well, and let's be honest, it is true, and it's said within this universe, Clark is told that he doesn't owe the world anything, and he really doesn't. He's not even from Earth. What does he owe Earth? But it's about his choices, to piggyback off of what you said, Curry. And once Clark chooses to expose himself, so to speak, to become Superman, to become known and not hide anymore, he's doing it precisely because he's counted the cost. He understands what the sacrifice may look like. He has heeded his father's and mother's words about counting that cost and understanding the nature and purpose of sacrifice and doing it for the right reasons. And so when he finally does, it comes from a moral place where he's making the decision, and he's not doing it because he just feels like he has to or feels like he needs to. It's not out of obligation. It's because Clark has finally decided to adopt Earth as his home and reconcile with the fact that Krypton no longer exists and is no longer his home.
When he investigates who he is, when he hears about the ship and the ice and all that, he isn't as careful as he could be. He's followed by a reporter who almost died that he has to reveal himself to. That reporter writes a piece, then decides to hold it back, but that still gets leaked, and that puts her in danger later on. But because he activates the ship, that brings the Kryptonians there. So by not fully, completely heeding Jonathan's advice in those moments, by even just seeking into who he is, he changes the world. So there's a dangerous weight to anything and everything he does. And I think that philosophy is reinforced more and more as it goes on.
There are not, like, in life, which is why I love that Man of Steel and BVS in particular deal with these. There are no perfect solutions. There are oftentimes trade-offs. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't still do the right thing, but even by doing the right thing, you need to understand there's going to be a trade-off, and there will be consequences, and there will be a domino effect of some kind where some people think you're doing the right thing. Other people, because of their worldview, don't think you're doing the right thing. And you have to be willing to accept the consequences of even doing what you think the right thing is, because there are no perfect solutions. Oftentimes there are trade-offs, and you're almost always trading one thing for another. And so I don't see Clark's parents as telling him, don't do this. In fact, they are trying to make sure that he makes the decisions for himself. And that, to me, is some of the best advice and guidance that, especially given the gravity of this story and the choices that he would be making one way or the other, best advice and guidance that parents can give. The only way I can liken it is if a teenager comes up to his parents and says, I want to join the military. Any patriot, any patriot would kind of go, oh, son, daughter, that's incredible. I'm so glad you want to serve the country and get involved like that. Now let's talk about this. Let's talk about the choices that need to be made. Let's talk about the sacrifice, not only for you, but for your family. Let's dig into this question of you joining the military and becoming a servant like that, in which you may even have to put your life on the line or die.
Yep.
And that's the best comparison that I can make in a world where Superman doesn't exist, is a conversation between a child and parents about joining the military, frankly.
Yep.
And it's not that they're discouraging it and saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't serve your country. Let's discuss what that means, the gravity of that decision.
Yep. The power to change things and what it means. There's a huge weight with that. And they showcase that with like 2 lines of dialogue. I love it. The acting is so good.
It's such an amazing scene. And, one thing that I really liked about it as well with the screenplay is that in so many films, and, especially with superhero films, sometimes, we get these kind of almost unrealistic portrayals of people and how they react to certain situations. And I appreciated that this kind of script allowed things to go in a slightly different direction. That's like, as you were saying, I agree with everything that you guys said about, Jonathan Kent. And I also kind of like that the script kind of showcases him as very emotional, in the sense too, that, with that uncertainty, when he's saying like, maybe, we're seeing also just like a conflicted parent who is extremely emotional and terrified of losing their child and terrified of seeing what's happening. And it's almost kind of like those scenarios that you hear on, where people will talk about as a parent, like, oh, if you had to choose between, your child or saving somebody else, who would you go towards? And most parents would say in a heat of emotion, well, I'm going to save my child over everything else. I don't care if 100 people die. I'm going to save my child, and I appreciated that the film kind of delved into those emotional responses that people have, and kind of looking into and saying necessarily it's when people say like, oh, emotions are not right or wrong, it's just how you feel. And I appreciated that we kind of got to see a little bit of Jonathan Kent, this very moral, upstanding man, dealing with some of these torrential, emotions within himself, and trying to, as you said, Josh, have Clark make these decisions for himself, while kind of dealing with the agony of seeing, what that could result in.
Well, yeah. And it's one of those things too, where people confuse Pa Kent's guidance with saying, oh, well, he was, steering Clark in the wrong direction. Or some even go so far as to saying that Pa Kent was giving him immoral advice and immoral guidance. And I just could not disagree more with.
He's also saying maybe it's not up to you to decide who lives and dies. You're not God. But also, the immediate scene following, he tells Clark who he is, where he comes from, and that he has a responsibility to decide who he's going to be when he stands in front of the human race. And there's so much weight to that. But also that question, what was I supposed to do? Let him die? As a kind of a segue to, because it relates directly to this, that same question is asked again in the film when Jonathan Kent dies. And in that moment, Jonathan Kent, he may not be able to tell Clark, yes, you should have let those kids die, but he does say, yes, you should let me die in the greater service of this. And that moment, I think, is an even harder pill for people to swallow.
Well, it is, but it should speak. It should at least correct some people's perceptions of Pa Kent in this movie, because once again, he's willing, as you said, Curry, he's willing to sacrifice himself for his son and for the greater good. He, as the father, takes on that burden in that moment to sacrifice himself for his son, his family, and what he thinks the greater good is at the time, because he doesn't think Clark is ready to go public with who he actually is. And so Pa Kent is the one laying his life down and giving the example for Clark to follow at some point. And
No,
people miss that. People miss that. And I don't understand how they miss that.
No, absolutely. Like, I think especially, the death of Pa Kent, probably one of the most misunderstood moments in the film, and probably honestly, the entire DCEU. People do not understand the sacrificial element of it. They don't understand, what, and especially, and I don't understand how it's not understood, because as you said earlier, Josh, we see how every action that Clark takes leads up to the climax of the film, basically, that we see the results of what he does, that how Pa Kent had told him that basically everything you do is going to change the world, every single thing. And we see that as the film develops, that every single thing he does, even to breaking out of the handcuffs, just absolutely, astonishes people and challenges everything that they believe in. One thing just that I tell people a lot as well, besides the philosophical aspects of like Pa Kent's death, we see that Clark is not fully developed at that point. He hasn't fully, embraced all of his powers. He still hasn't, fully become, the full-on version of Superman that we see, in Zack Snyder's Justice League. And so it's like him saving his father would have absolutely been caught, on camera. People would have absolutely seen him for, the godlike being that he was in that moment if he would have acted.
Yeah. So I have kind of a long thing about this in my notes. The lines after this flashback, when it happens, there were dozens, if not hundreds of people at that overpass that would have seen him do this, like you mentioned, Byron. But the line is, "I let my father die because I trusted him, because he believed the world wasn't ready." And the tough pill to swallow, and it still challenges me to this day. I have to wrestle with it. Is it that if Jonathan Kent would do this, I think that is unquestionably in character of Jonathan Kent, telling his son, like, no, don't risk it for me. But the question that I think people struggle with is if Clark would truly let him do this. Like, would Superman really let him? And honestly, as a longtime Superman fan, and most iterations, no, he wouldn't. The typical cause is a heart attack that kills Superman or Superman's dad because he can't stop that. Young Clark would have thrown caution to the wind in a lot of this and saved him, no pun intended, with the wind. That was terrible. or he would fail trying. He would try maybe. And people say, well, it shouldn't have been a dog Jonathan went back for. It should have been a kid. The natural disaster is a great way to do it. Maybe he could stop it and saved everyone, but had to reveal himself to some, and nearly being discovered from the bus accident, he saves one of those people again, and Jonathan Kent still couldn't die, but he tried. But you kind of start to get away from the idea that he knows his father's thoughts, and think about the previous conversation. He steps up to do it. But with the religious symbolism that is all over this film, there's such a great representation of the Christian Trinity in this film, with Clark being the Son, Jonathan being the Father, and Jor-El being the Holy Spirit. He looks to his father, and his father says no, and he submits to the will of his father, representing, Christ submitting to the will of the Father. And this version of Clark lives in a much scarier, harsher reality that's not too different from our own, which is also the whole point. His responsibility of honing his powers isn't just about not hurting people and using them for good, but also when to hide them, as he could save his dad and change the world, but also his parents' lives, Smallville, everyone involved in that incident in the process. And Jonathan Kent knows this, which is why he lays down his life, like y'all said. But it is a ballsy decision to have Superman see it happen, have the power to stop it, but not to for a purpose greater than himself. And honestly, maybe he was wrong. It's arguable that had Clark come forward sooner, humanity could have trusted him before Zod arrived. But would they have really accepted an alien immigrant? Would they have quarantined Smallville and tried to hurt Clark and everyone he knows being questioned? Clark trusted and submitted, and he clearly regrets it. We see that throughout the trilogy. But he trusted his father, and he ends up being proven right, not just in how the military treats him, but how the world treats him in BVS. And then he does the same thing his father does. He sacrifices the last thing he can, his life, for a world that hated him. There's your Christ-like comparison again. And all this is reinforced by the religious symbolism, him visiting the priest or pastor and asking questions about what God thinks. Did God make me this way? And also the effect he has coming full circle with his whole ideology. You know, he lets his father die because it'll change the world. Then he lets himself die, which also changes the world, which is why BBS's moment of, if you seek his monument, look around you, because he saved us. And without that, you know, the world would have ended. And so it's this deeply challenging idea that Superman has to be more than just a hero. He has to be more than just an idea. He has to be the very thing that can make the choices we can't, right? It's hard. I struggle with it. You know, I've seen so many things in Superman media, and it's hard to accept that Clark would do it. But with his upbringing, with the religious symbolism and all that, as a philosophy, it does work, and you can make it work, and it fits very well tonally with the rest of the movie.
Well, and it was established very early on, and this seems to be consistent through all interpretations of Clark's relationship with his earthly father, that he has an intense amount of love and respect for Jonathan Kent. So much respect. And so I can look at it and go, he honored and respected the beliefs and will of Jonathan Kent in that moment, and let it happen. And that's to your point that you've already made, Curry, but I just wanted to echo it, that he showed the greatest love and admiration and respect for his father by yielding.
Yes.
And saying, this is going to be painful. This is going to be terrible. I don't want to lose you, but damn it, I love and respect you and honor you. And I know you're a good man. And so I'm going to stand there through tears and watch it happen, because you're telling me it's the right choice. And I'm going to choose to believe you and trust you. And so I don't have an issue, as difficult as it is, and as people see conflicts there with maybe how Superman has been historically represented, where he will just make what he feels like is the right decision regardless of what anybody else thinks. It plays into the father-son dynamic so very well.
No, absolutely. And I think it's interesting too that, you know, this scene, you know, of Pa Kent's death is likely, you know, one of the most important scenes in the DCEU, because this is the moment, you know, as you guys were saying, you know, that solidifies basically Superman's moral ethic, you know, because he sees, you know, that he has so much love and respect for his father, and he sees his father, you know, being willing to and ending up actually giving up his life for his moral beliefs, that is what solidifies Superman to be who he becomes later on, that he sees how much his father cared about these things and how much his father put so much weight into his beliefs that he was willing to sacrifice his life, that is what it solidified who Superman and Clark would become later on. And also, you know, one other thing I'd like to point out that is just like emotionally devastating as well is that, you know, right in the scene before the tornado, you know, we have that argument scene between Jonathan and Clark, you know, when he says to his father, you know, you basically, I can't remember the exact line, but he basically says, "You're not my dad." But then the last words he says to his father when he's about to die is he calls him dad. It's just like such a sad and devastating scene.
It is. And why would, let me ask this question too, like, why would, in that moment, as difficult as it was, and Clark knowing his father, by saving him in that moment, Clark would have kind of destroyed and undercut what Jonathan was fighting for and had even suffered for by taking on Clark as his adopted son and doing everything that he could to protect him and keep the world from knowing about him for a time. And so the irony here is jumping in and saving Jonathan at that moment would have actually undercut and destroyed what Jonathan was fighting for and even suffering for. I mean, I think about, and I know it's completely different, but I think about the conversation in Empire Strikes Back that Yoda has with Luke, where Luke wants to run off and save his friends, and Yoda goes, "You could help them, but you could also destroy all for which they have fought and suffered.
Well, and I know
and you could morally undercut them by doing this, taking away their agency and it's very, very similar dynamic here. I think the subtext is very obvious and very clear.
What's the first thing that happens after he's revealed? And everyone he knows is either attacked, kidnapped by the government, and he's taken and treated like with hostility, which is exactly, what everyone was afraid of. When a reporter gets wind of who he is, she tracks down everyone he has ever known and worked with to find out more. To be thankful it was Lois and not, somebody with ulterior motives. The film is, when you look at it from 1,000-foot view, we see the choice of like, what was I supposed to do? Should I let them die? They had that with Jonathan, or they have that with the bus full of kids. Then they have it with Jonathan. Then it's presented 2 more times. The first being the Genesis chamber on the ship with Zod. And he says, if you destroy this, you destroy Krypton. I remember reading a review before that. They said Superman makes a choice in this movie that won't sit well with people. And I'm like, that is now looking back, I'm like, that's incredibly vague. They were talking about Zod and his death. But this was the moment that I thought was the real controversial one. Now, to correct a bunch of wrong opinions out there, a bunch of people who completely misread and didn't pay attention to the world building, the Genesis chamber is not filled with fetuses, okay? They are not Kryptonian babies in stasis. It is chambers that have to have the seed of life, like the DNA, like put in them, and then those chambers allow the fetuses to be grown. And there's not like Kryptonian eggs in there. All that DNA, that's what the codex is that's in Superman's body. For it to even be used, those pods, that's why the codex has to be harvested. Every living Kryptonian ever, his DNA is in Superman's body. So when he destroys it, he's not killing a bunch of babies. There are people who legitimately think that, like, that's not what the film is doing. So that being said, his choice to say Krypton had its chance. There are living and breathing people here now who are in danger of destroying themselves, and I'm prioritizing them. He makes a decision
that's huge
for a new Krypton by destroying. He could choose Krypton and destroy his newfound home because of the decision he made for himself to find out who he is, and the entire world suffers. And it's in his own fortress of solitude that this potential happens. This Genesis chamber. So in this opening story of Superman finding himself, literally his place in the world, the extent of his powers, people, and responsibility, what can he give besides his life? He gives the potential for his world to come back. He sacrifices so much more than just himself. His chance at restoring his people. He does that, and then the only Kryptonians left are him and Zod, right? So he ends the potential, of course, pisses Zod off. And then he's presented with the reverse of the Jonathan Kent situation. Because what's he supposed to do? Let those people die? It's the same question all over again. But to save them, he has to become like Zod and kill Zod, but also he has to destroy the last living member of his race that he knows about, of course.
Well, and the absolute, that scene is just, gosh, it makes me emotional even just thinking about it, because the absolute pain and grief that he experiences in that moment. He did not do it happily. He did not do it with a smile on his face. I mean, when I've seen the scene in the old Superman movies where Zod apparently gets killed, and there's no grief or remorse, there. But in this moment, Clark is broken. He is so broken over it, and so remorseful over having to make the decision, even though it was the right decision, even though he had to do it. It completely broke him to have to do it.
And Snyder, he said in a recent interview, I think it was with Variety or something like that, he said that in this moment, he wanted Superman to give it all, pushing past his own morals for us, in quotations, as he meant that's what. Like, Superman can do that. He can push past any boundaries to do the right thing. He didn't want to kill Zod. He begged Zod to stop. But Zod had reiterated several times throughout their battle that he would kill as many as possible. Feora says it earlier, for everyone you save, we'll kill 1 million more. Zod was destroying as much as possible, causing as much collateral damage as he could. And people often misread that fight as like, Superman should have flown away and not caused as much damage. I'm like, okay, the whole time Superman's barely in control of that fight because Zod is way more experience. Superman's just more powerful after having been in the sun, and his lack of experience kind of shows in that scene. But also, sorry, I was going to say, the only moment Superman actually destroys something intentionally is when Zod is pushing him through buildings and Superman turns around and shoves his face through a bunch of windows. Like, give the guy a break, right? And so the whole time, Zod is saying, like, I will kill all of them. So if he had flown away, that wouldn't have worked, Zod would have just started wrecking all the humans. And then they're like, well, in the moment, why did he snap Zod's neck? Why didn't he knock him out or fly up through the building with him? I'm like, anything you say there, any maneuver, Zod could have broken out of that hold and just started killing everyone. It was the only choice.
Absolutely. And what people, I think, also don't realize is that Zod was becoming more powerful by the second, because we see that he literally, reached the same level basically as Superman in complete control of his powers within probably about like a 30-minute period, where what took Superman 30 years, to harness, Zod did in 30 minutes. And he was soaking up more of the sun every moment. He was just becoming more and more powerful. And if Superman didn't stop that fight, it was very possible that he would not have been able to stop Zod if that fight would have continued on longer.
Right. And what do you do with a madman bent on genocide with godlike powers that forces you into a position where it's an impossible choice? Break a code in anguish or let innocents die. Snyder actually compared this to Star Trek's Kobayashi Maru, which is the unwinnable scenario test that all the captains have to go through. Superman does what's necessary, as he has many times in the comics when forced to. He sacrifices more for humanity by killing Zod. And as Josh said, that scream in anguish is giving us all the subtext we need into reading that scene. And I don't understand what the big conundrum is. Like, it's clearly, he says, Zod, please stop. And what does Zod say? Never.
Well, and right, and once Earth becomes his adopted home, and he makes that decision, it becomes even more clear, to Clark what he has to do, and let's not forget that Zod's worldview and just how much of a zealot he is, and how he doesn't care about the people of Earth and what happens to them. He only cares about his race. Zod is no different in worldview than some of the people on Earth who don't care about what happens to Clark because he's an alien who does not seemingly belong on that planet.
Yep.
And so Clark is being pressed in by zealots on both sides here who essentially share a very similar worldview to a large degree, where again, Zod doesn't care about what happens to the people of the Earth. There are people on Earth who don't care about what happens to Clark because he doesn't belong with them and he's a threat to them. And Clark still has to make the conscious decision that, well, there are good people here. Krypton had its chance. I was raised here, and I'm gonna make a choice to save as many innocent lives as possible. And so that is just Clark being pressed in like that and isolated like that, and having to make a decision to save a world in which there are people in it that hate and fear him is the ultimate choice.
Yeah, and the film's all about choices. I mean, literally, in the whole like inciting incident is Superman is a child born not with like a particular purpose like Zod was or Jor-El was. Zod calls it heresy. So Clark represents everything that Zod doesn't believe in. He says the sole purpose for which I was made was to protect my people. And like, where were you trained? On a farm? The choice then becomes, and all the convo with Jor-El, he says, what if a child aspired to something greater? And to be greater, Clark has to make the choices that normal people can't. And that's exactly what he does, which includes killing Zod. And what even just drives me crazy about all of that is like, this is the Superman that people were asking for, giving what the fans what they wanted. It doesn't seem like it should be fan service, but it is in a lot of ways. A Superman who punches things, who is as powerful as he is gentle, who fiercely protects his home. And those Dragon Ball Z level fights are some of the best spectacle I've experienced in the theater. Like,
I love those. Oh
what
my
more
gosh.
could you want? Like, it balances like thematic content with spectacle better than most blockbusters I've ever seen personally. This whole trilogy does.
It really, Man of Steel is a miracle. I agree, Curry, because it is still mind-boggling how effortlessly it balances things, how effortlessly it balances the fantastical and the grounded, and it feels so seamless somehow still within this film. And we have seen so many movies where the grounded and the fantastical are not balanced well at all, and they just seem like movies at war with itself, with themselves. Man of Steel is not at war with itself. Man of Steel has an identity all its own, and it lives within that identity, and it balances those elements so very well so that you can go from the grounded to the fantastical without skipping a beat and it still being believable. And not many movies within this genre in particular do that. They don't. I mean, some go all the way fantastical and leave every element of being grounded off the table, and some go completely grounded and don't get fantastical at all. Like the Dark Knight trilogy is extraordinarily grounded and doesn't even dabble really in the fantastical. And so Man of Steel is like it's like the unicorn of this genre. And where it's able to do it all effortlessly.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And there's just so much this movie does that we don't have time to talk about. Like, it is such a like pro-birth, pro-life movie at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It is. There's a video essay that got really popular a long time ago about, and not to be crass or anything, but there is a comparison that the whole film, like seeing Clark as a sperm seeking an egg, like seeking his home, seeking where to create life, seeking where to blossom. And then you look at and you're like, oh, that's a reach. And then you're like, no, look at the designs of the Kryptonian chips, the interiors, lots of the walls. And I saw this as a criticism one time. I'd never noticed it. Lots of the walls look like birth canals near the Genesis chamber. If you look at Zod,
that actually, that is very true. Actually, I hadn't thought of that.
Look at Zod and the Kryptonians that get sent to the Phantom Zone. The little things they get like sent in the little pods. I'm trying not to be funny here, but they do look like penises being launched, like things being launched like fear. And then they come out. They have different motivations. Who's going to win? Who's going to like actually create the new Kryptonian life? There's just so much like subtext there about birth, and like it opens with a birth. That it's fascinating to break down. That's really diving deep. But my point with that is that this is not a movie that was flippantly written as a cash grab with like nothing but an action fest to satisfy Hollywood studio executives that wanted Superman to make the money. This was a very deliberate, artful approach to reinventing Superman. How do they do that? They do that with all these ideas that we've already covered at in great length. But what is the other like most important part of Superman on the big screen is the music that goes with him. It's like, okay, well, Superman Returns did the whole John Williams theme. We had that Triumphant Return. Smallville did the same thing. How do we be different? How do you top or even compare to the big bombastic John Williams score? You don't. You do a simplistic Hans Zimmer score. That's like a 2-note motif that eventually becomes bombastic, but is that simple recurring motif that re-emphasizes the emotional core of the movie through and through. And arguably, I mean, the John Williams score is more iconic, but if I'm sitting listening to music, the Man of Steel theme is just perfect.
Well, and on top of that, the Man of Steel score in general by Hans Zimmer is easily one of the best scores in the entire genre. And I would even say, if you were going to rank movie scores, Man of Steel would be up there in general among the greats.
Oh, man.
I don't see how you can. I mean, Zimmer's work is pristine, and I don't know what else to say about it.
And I know I went from birth canals to music. I know that was a bit of a transition.
Well, but what a better transition, though, even thematically. We were talking about the transition between with Nolan's involvement and the transition between the Dark Knight trilogy and Man of Steel, what better person again to make that transition, to make it feel a bit more seamless and natural for Hans Zimmer to go from the Dark Knight trilogy to Man of Steel. Just made sense. Do it that way, and for there to be kind of like, again, even though Man of Steel and the Dark Knight trilogy are not in the same continuity, the Man of Steel is very much a spiritual successor to the Dark Knight trilogy. It is written on the walls of that movie.
Completely agree. I love the headcanon them together, actually.
What's that?
I love the headcanon them together. That's actually the same world.
Oh yeah, no, totally. I mean, I absolutely do. I mean, that just it makes sense. I mean, you can even headcanon, you could say that after The Dark Knight Rises, if Bruce did not in fact die, but he just disappeared for a while, and then came back, as the Batman in BVS, you can kind of headcanon that.
Yeah,
a little bit.
Really not hard.
a little bit too. Or you can say, well, what if BVS took place after The Dark Knight and not The Dark Knight Rises? And you just kind of like go, well, we're going to kind of take The Dark Knight Rises and put it over here, but then like Man of Steel comes after The Dark Knight, and then BVS comes after that. I mean, there's so many different ways you can kind of try to do that if you want to and have fun with it. Hans Zimmer, I mean, you couldn't have made a better choice going with him and him kind of creating the musical tapestry and tone that Nolan and Snyder were going for with Man of Steel. And I just going to echo too, the fights are awesome and I love them, and I will never have a bit of criticism over those fights. And I know even some people do. They're like, oh, they're way over the top and it's just too much. No, you have like superhuman beings fighting each other here. I mean, it's going to be like unlike anything you've ever seen. I think you, and I know you're a huge Dragon Ball Z fan, Curry. So you likening those fights to like DBZ style fights is very apropos. But I couldn't agree with you more that that's exactly what they feel like when you're watching them. And I love them.
And my point with tying all those like random points together is just the fact that this was very intentionally thought through as a film. It's not it's not something where they were just like, let's throw everything and see what sticks on the wall. No, there's too many connected threads that I've naturally stumbled upon just talking about it out loud. And Byron, actually, it's kind of hilarious. I just glanced at your notes that you sent us. You called this the birth of the DCU. There we are again.
Yeah.
The whole birth motif. And it literally births a new universe at the same time. That is oddly fitting. If you can't tell, I really, really love this movie.
It's, it is so true what you guys said, that, this film, just there's so many, all the threads come together, to make this a great movie. You have the script, you have the score, it's like the filmmaking, the set design, just everything is incredible. Cause like, I remember, I saw a behind the scenes, photographs and everything, where I saw that a lot of the Kryptonian, combat suits were CGI. And I was like, what? It's like, these looked so spectacular and they hold up so well. Just like everything comes together in this movie in a beautiful, beautiful way. And, and I think that, even 10 years later now, it still holds up so well. And it's just it's incredible. And just I want to say too, like a little bit with the filmmaking and the fights that you guys were mentioning, I love the detail that is put into those fights, because sometimes in comic book films you see a kind of disconnect between maybe the blow that has landed on somebody and the reaction or something, that it can seem a little weightless in some ways. And I love that there is full gravity given to these fights, that like when Zod punches Superman, you see the shockwave go and like crumble a building or something. You see the result of the heat vision when it's unleashed in one of the skyscrapers. I love that gravitas that is given to those fights.
you worded that perfectly in saying that the CGI isn't weightless. That's something I was going to talk about, and the gravity of it. Like, I couldn't have said that better myself. But also on the flip side of that, Snyder also makes all of the scenes seem so intimate because he knows exactly when and when not to use handheld camera to emphasize, because a lot of times handheld camera movements, just that subtle like shake that you get from it, are used for very intimate scenes to make it feel more intimate. And he uses them in sections, of course, like when you're in Smallville and the characters are talking, but he also uses it in action sequences, like when the military fires upon Superman and the Kryptonians and you see a bullet hit his head. It's like, what? And then the camera goes still in a moment of awe when the van is thrown at the helicopter. Like, just the small subtle ways in which the camera is used to communicate feeling and tension is just brilliant. Along with CGI. I had no idea that the suits were actually CGI. That makes a ton of sense. I love the brutality that Snyder sneaks in with the Kryptonians. Like, the one jumps on the plane and you see him grab the pilot and the guy just disappears into a cloud of blood. And then Faye were like going absolutely ham. Like, I literally remember in the theater, like, people were going, Dragon Ball Z! Like, this is what. So that's why there's this huge like fan petition for Zack Snyder to, if there ever were another live action take of that, like, he showed that he's the one who can.
I mean, he would kill it. He would absolutely kill it. Like, because he loves buff and fit characters. That's kind of all he ever features, And I mean, it's just, and he loves being bombastic. I mean, you cannot. I just recently, and I'm a big Zack Snyder fan, but I had to kind of go backwards. Speaking of bombastic, like I just watched for the very first time Sucker Punch, and it was the extended cut. I mean, you want to talk about bombastic and over the top. Sucker Punch is absolutely that. And I know we don't have time to talk about Sucker Punch. I actually think it's a good movie. That's a controversial take, but I think it's a good movie. But I actually like Sucker Punch, which is crazy. And I thought I would, and my suspicions were correct. But Snyder would just be perfect for that. And I agree. Like, just, it's not weightless. There is real gravity to those fight scenes. There's a lot of emotion wrapped into all of them. And we can't ignore that Snyder's collaboration with that he had going for a good while with Larry Fong as his cinematographer. We have to give credit there too. And in my opinion, Snyder's visual brilliance has never been better when it's paired with Larry Fong's cinematography. I hold that to this day, and I long for the day where Zack Snyder and Larry Fong can reunite as both being like visual geniuses, because every movie that they've done together has just been an absolute feast for the eyes and extremely intentional visually. And there were other movies that even Fong wasn't involved with that they tried to recreate that visual look as much as they could. I mean, Wonder Woman's an example.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Cause that the look and feel that Snyder did establish in Man of Steel and continue in BVS, absolutely gone on. I mean, we saw elements of that in Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, of course. Wonder Woman was probably the most spiritual successor, to Snyder in the sense of being a different film, but feel. And then, we even saw that kind of come back very heavily in Black Adam, which we'll get to later on in the podcast, had a very Snyder feel to it in a lot of ways.
Well, and then even Zack Snyder's Justice League, and we finally got to see, was it Fabian Wagner? Is that who was the cinematographer? Mm-hmm. So the aesthetic came back. Too, even with Wagner's cinematography, and his cinematography was utterly destroyed by Whedon's theatrical cut of Justice League. It was just absolutely we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I cannot wait to get to that. But that beautiful visual continuity of Snyder's films and Wonder Woman, and even Suicide Squad was just completely destroyed in the theatrical cut of Justice League, and I was just glad to see it come back in Zack Snyder's Justice League again. But yeah, we can rant and rave about that later when I guess we're going to be forced to watch the theatrical cut of Justice League. I tell you what, that is the episode I am most looking forward to, because it is going to be an absolute disaster in some ways. Like it's like a disaster in such a beautiful, glorious way. I cannot wait to talk about it.
Yeah. So guys, there's also some things that people say about this movie. You know, we've already talked about a little bit that people give Superman crap for like the destruction at the end of the movie, even though he was doing everything he could to hold Zod. We've talked about that, and we have a whole movie dealing with the aftermath of that whole idea. But people say like, oh, they should have showed him saving civilians, even though he was in the middle of a fight with somebody that was trying to kill civilians. But my thing is, in the Smallville battle, he does save civilians. He tells them all to go inside. He saves the pilot when he falls out of the helicopter. They go out of their way to show that. But the film also reinforces the idea that a lot of people miss this, how inexperienced Superman is. Like when he's fighting Feora, when he first tackles Zod, he goes through like the cornfields and then that like little plant or whatever, the like corn mill or whatever it looked like. And then like they end up flying through a gas station that blows up, and there's this look on Superman's face like, oh crap, like he didn't mean to do that, but out of anger, he made a choice to make an attack. And there was consequences. It ties in thematically, but the film doesn't spoon feed that to you. So it's like people just see that and like, oh, this Superman doesn't care if he blows up people. There's another moment in the battle with Zod where Zod kicks a gasoline truck at him. Superman dodges it and goes back down and blows up behind him. Zod uses that distraction and start beating the snot out of him. It's like, Superman, you should have stopped. And maybe some of these moments could have been communicated better, but they're showing that Superman is inexperienced, and every choice, every consequence, even just dodging a truck that's meant to hurt him has consequences. And I love that it uses these like otherwise mundane action moments, not mundane, but like what seems like people would just say, oh, that's just another explosion. It's like, oh no, this is communicating something. I appreciate that. And I think all of these ideas are only communicated so well because of the cast of the movie delivering all these lines. Because the cast in this movie is phenomenal. We haven't really talked about him a lot, but Russell Crowe's Jor-El, inspired. Of course, Kevin Costner is Jonathan Kent. He's like, that is the most Jonathan Kent looking Jonathan Kent I've ever seen in my life. Michael Shannon as Zod is like top 5 comic book villains, movie villains. And Henry Cavill, you know, I think Henry Cavill is very misunderstood in the role. He's a much more reserved Superman, who is clearly like wants to be the extrovert, but he's introverted by nature because of being tortured, but he's still deeply affectionate, and he's still jovial, like when he's around the people he knows and loves. And I really appreciate the reserved take after you have so many other Supermen that kind of take the opposite route. And like this shows how he was going to become that. I do have nitpicks, you know. I think in some of those moments, like where they maybe could have communicated certain things better with Superman's inexperience, I can hand wave them easily. You know, I think along with the destruction, after he has that scream in anguish at the end, you know, I think they could have had another short scene of sitting with that destruction and the weight of it on Superman, like him seeing the aftermath a little bit more than they did, instead of cutting to the drone shot, like of the drone, literally the drone shot of the drone getting taken out. And you know, there's little nitpicks like that, but it's so hard to ignore all this film does right. And even like in hindsight as the trilogy, and I know there may be some disagreement on this, but I even love what it adds thematically to the movie when you reconsider that general, I think what is his name? The general who ends up being Martian Manhunter. The fact that he is Martian Manhunter the whole time, his conversations with Superman take on a whole new meaning. And it adds to the story and so much for me personally in Man of Steel, especially.
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's you know, you mentioned a little bit of the cast there, and it is just, the cast is outstanding. You know, it's like, it's packed full of talent, you know, even down to the smaller roles, you know, of you know, like Colonel Nathan Hardy has just so many standout great moments. You know, it was General Swanwick, who is Martian Manhunter. You know, he's fantastic. Just, you know, Michael Shannon is incredible. You know, like you said, Russell Crowe, you know, I would venture to say, I think, you know, Russell Crowe in this role is probably one of his best roles he's ever done. You know, 100%. You know, it's incredible. And all of them have,
and it's so short
we're
too.
able
He
to
has so
complement
little
each
screen
other.
time.
Oh yeah, it's like he's buried. Yeah, it's like he's in that introduction, and then he's basically just in it as like the AI ghost for the rest of it. And yeah, he does not have that much screen time, but his impact is felt so heavily throughout the whole thing. It's just it's amazing. But as we kind of just as we kind of wind down our conversation here of Man of Steel, what are your guys' like final thoughts on it, and also what is your rating of this particular movie?
Well, final thoughts, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. Knock on wood. I've never been known for brevity, but I'm going to try to practice that as much as possible in my closing remarks here. We really need buzzers like a presidential debate. Of course, they go over the buzzers anyway, so what difference does it make? But first of all, Man of Steel is in my top 5 favorite comic book films ever. And that says a lot coming from somebody who has never naturally gravitated towards Superman as a character. That's how much regard I have for this movie within the genre, and how I was able to feel for Superman and Clark as a character, and his internal conflict, the external conflicts that were surrounding him and pressing him in. And so for me to say that Man of Steel is in my top 5 within the genre is meaningful, first of all. Second of all, I think that the Man of Steel is an absolutely stunning masterpiece, and I have to go and check my Letterboxd. I know I at least gave it a 4.5, but even after this discussion, I'm going to bump it if it is to 5, because I just, you get to a point with a movie sometimes where even if you have little nitpicks here or there, it does not affect your overall experience whatsoever. And I think when you get to that point, you kind of have to go, well, if we're looking for absolute and total perfection in a movie made by human beings, you also being an imperfect person, you're really going to disappoint yourself. And so I think that Man of Steel is probably about as perfect of a Superman movie as you can get. And so if I don't have it at 5, I'm gonna go bump it right after this discussion, because that's how great this discussion has been. My closing remark, other than that, is to just push back respectfully on this idea that this Superman was not hopeful, that he was somehow this emo Superman who whined and complained all the time. I think that is just completely off base than with what we see in the movie itself. Yes, he had internal conflict. Yes, he had sadness. Yes, he struggled with his place in the world. Yes, he had an existential crisis to an extent, because he was kind of caught between two worlds and two identities. But Clark was still hopeful. Clark still loved the people around him. Clark still had a moral compass that he was willing to follow to its conclusion. He was not this hopeless, whiny, emo Superman that some people try to peg him as being. Was he more grounded? Yes, absolutely. He was more grounded. He didn't run around happy all the time. He had moments of in which he wasn't sure of himself. But to go so far as to say that he didn't have hope, that he was this hopeless Superman, really doesn't bear itself out with the film that we were given. And I would really challenge people to go back and watch it and focus on Clark and Superman as a character, and not confuse the fact that, yeah, the film has a bit of a darker aesthetic visually to it. Yes, but to go, oh, that's a dark film, or that was a dark Superman. Come on, guys. Like, give the movie credit where it's due. Give the character and the interpretation of the character credit where it's due. Rewatch the movie. And I really think that if you grapple with the themes in this film and who Clark is portrayed to be, you will hopefully come away after a rewatch with going, no, he was still a hopeful Superman. He was still trying to be a beacon for the world, but he became that beacon at the right time, at the time where he could handle it and accept the consequences of it. And that comes full circle at the end of Batman v Superman, which I can't wait for us to get to, because another controversial take is BVS is in my top 5 comic book films, and I think it's a stone cold masterpiece, possibly even more so than Man of Steel is, especially the Ultimate Edition. So I can't wait to get to that too. But this Superman walked that line between he was hopeful, he was loving, he was compassionate, but he was also trying to find his place, and he does find his place. And he becomes that Superman that some say he should have been all along. But as I always tell people, like, character arcs exist for a reason, and if you're not willing to kind of go along with an arc and see it to its conclusion, you're probably wanting a character that comes out fully baked in order to satisfy some sense of nostalgia or need for nostalgia that you have, instead of wanting to go on a journey with a particular character. And so I just really respectfully challenge those who are listening to rewatch this movie and see it for the intention that's clearly there, even with some criticisms that you may have.
Beautifully said, Josh. To your point about this Superman and how people perceive him as emo and things like that, I've heard it said by multiple people that, oh, this version of Clark is just Batman in a Superman suit. And I'm like, that, if anything, that is a mischaracterization of Batman more than anything.
Yeah.
Like, there is zero brooding in this movie, guys. Like, come on. Look how much he smiles in this movie too. People get on Cavill's Superman for not smiling enough, and I'm not just singling out a certain friend of ours who says that, because I get in BVS is the dark Superman story, but that's for a particular purpose and a greater, larger arc. But looking at Man of Steel as a whole, this is a very, all things considered, a very happy, joyful Superman who is hopeful when everything around him isn't. And I think that's what's beautiful about it.
I mean, he's literally smiling when he's talking about hope and what the symbol on his chest means.
Exactly. You just took the words right out of my mouth.
It's when he gets to recall what that symbol means that he carries and what it means on his world, he's beaming, because it's bringing him back to that. And so I guess some people just, they have unrealistic expectations, and they just wanted him to run around with a giant grin on his face.
I think people were less interested in how Superman became Superman, and they were expecting Superman in whatever story. Like, Superman's already there. But how someone becomes someone like Superman, I thought was a brilliant way to approach his story. And for me, Man of Steel, easily 5-star. It's a masterpiece to me. I've already said that it's in my top 10 films of all time. I have 3 CBMs in my top 10 of all time. I am who I am. For me, this is only behind Spider-Man 2 and The Dark Knight. And even then, it's a close call some days. I think, it had a very, very profound effect on comic book movies, but also not just comic book movies, but movies as a whole, and especially film criticism and how you read films, looking at things from a subjective lens, but also an objective lens, and what the idea of a popular character like Superman means to people and how they approach it, and so many biases coming out, how films are talked about, how CBMs are talked about, I think are different because of the divisive reception of the film. I mean, the head of Rotten Tomatoes himself, can't think of his name, even said there are critics who disagree, but they got it wrong on this one with the consensus, because this is a wonderful, beautiful film. That's me paraphrasing. Which I think is fascinating.
And it's just sad because I'm a fan of the early MCU, and most of the Infinity Saga is good. But the downside to how the MCU started to shape perception about comic book films and how they should be, forced the DCU to kind of always live in the shadow of the MCU and not being taken as its own universe with its own concepts and ideas and ways of presenting itself. There were a lot of people who would just be like, well, why isn't it like the MCU? Why, and I'm just like, I was a fan of the early DCEU precisely because it wasn't the MCU.
Exactly. And that kind of hits on my next point. People don't give the Avengers grief for tearing up the city and Hulk smashing through buildings and stuff in the first Avengers movie. That's dealt with later in Civil War, but they give Man of Steel the same criticisms, and they want them to do the same things. They do some of the same things, but one gets criticized, one doesn't. There was an unfair standard. And later on, when the DCEU, as we'll get to, does become more like the MCU, guess what? The fans got mad, and they just said, oh, they're just trying to copy Marvel. There was no winning from the get-go. They had an uphill battle, and I respect it all the more for that. And I think also, you look at Man of Steel, what it did visually for CBMs, especially for the character of Superman and how fights are portrayed. Just a random example of that shot where he's flying and punching Zod, where it's like from his perspective, that was redone in Injustice 2 as Superman's like ultimate move. You look at Chloe Zhao on Eternals, and she said the biggest visual inspiration for it was Man of Steel, and
which is obvious.
Yeah,
it's so obvious.
100%. Like this movie altered really Superman, especially because you look also at Superman and Lois. That entire show's like visual Bible is based off of Man of Steel and how it portrayed Superman and his abilities and the world and the look of it. There's so much influence there. So I think this film is really important for so many reasons, even if it is extremely like love it or hate it, it seems to be. Very few people are in the middle on it. I think that makes it even more important.
We haven't yet gotten to the film that is even more divisive.
So that's what I was going to say. Like, somehow they upped their game and made the next one even more of a split thing, which I also adore.
God bless it. God bless it too.
And there's so much to talk about with that one, but I think when you're looking as a whole as like something that is a standalone film that works without any sequels, Man of Steel is a perfectly like wonderful origin standalone film that somehow at the same time opened the door for so much more to come in wonderful, wonderful ways. And I just absolutely adore it.
No, absolutely. And I think, that you can look at a film and, when you look at the impact that it's had on genres, you can see, whether it's going to hold up and how great it is. And I think that Man of Steel has absolutely impacted everything around it. As you guys touched on a little bit before, we've seen the impact in other shows and other movies. Even the creator of X-Men 97, used Man of Steel influences in some of his episodes. And he was very open about that. And, and even like, and this is not to, I'm not, criticizing anything, but just using this as an example. But just even when James Gunn released his recent first look at the suit for his Superman movie, what was it compared to? It was compared to the suit from Man of Steel. They weren't comparing it to Christopher Reeve's, suit. They weren't comparing it to the Superman Returns suit. They were looking at Man of Steel. And I think that just kind of shows the impact culturally that it had with fans, that is the go-to Superman movie that people are looking at to compare things to. In like I said, its set design, in its ideas, and and I would say, my rating, for this film is definitely, it's 5 stars. I consider it a masterpiece. I think it's incredible. I can't wait to talk about BVS because, like you said, they somehow managed to up their controversy game, and and I would kind of agree with that with Josh that possibly I might like BVS even better than Man of Steel, and I can't wait to discuss that. But yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. Really, really enjoyed it, and I think we got into some very, very good, nuanced and interesting, aspects to this movie.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I do want to say, look, if you don't like Man of Steel, okay, like,
Mhm.
but I do ask that if you're not going to like it, if you're not going to like anything, be willing to examine your criticisms, make sure they're fair and justified, and the why of them, and be ready to defend those things. If you're like, this is not the type of Superman story that resonates with me, and I wish they had focused more on other aspects that make the character that obviously would have come later had the arc been finished. Like, I prefer those types of Superman stories. Okay, that's like, I accept that. And there's other criticisms I accept. Even if I don't accept it, who cares? Like what you like, don't like what you don't like. But I do think that as a whole, we're cinephiles here, but the general population needs to be better about approaching the why of their arguments and the why of their feelings without saying like, man, that was bad. Well, why? Well, because it was stupid. Why? Like, tell me. Be willing to examine yourself. And I think this film has films like this, BVS, The Last Jedi, Eternals, like these popular genre movies that split fandoms. One of the reasons they all do that, and some would agree for better or worse on some, is because they're all movies that are willing to dive deep into subjects and challenge the viewers, and viewers don't like to be challenged.
Nope.
And if you don't like to be challenged, be honest with yourself. Do I like that or do I not? And one of the beautiful things about the DCEU is that it's a consistently challenging cinematic universe, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. But for that, I think it will always be remembered. And I think even Marvel started to take lessons from this as they started challenging their viewers later on because of the DC movies being willing to do so artistically.
But you saw, just as a side note, that when at least in the earlier MCU, when Iron Man 3 came out, which we don't have time to get into this. I think Iron Man 3 is a great movie, but it was divisive and fans were shocked by how divisive it was. And Marvel did not go back to the well, so to speak, for a while after that, as far as rocking the boat a little bit. They kind of, they were like, oh, I guess we stepped too far here. So now we've got to, we gotta rein it in a bit more. But yeah, I mean, later on they decided to experiment a bit more, and sometimes that worked and sometimes that didn't. But I will give credit where it's due that they did start to do that a little bit more. But I just wanted to make the point that they tried with Iron Man 3 and just got raked over the.
I mean, they did for Iron Man 3, for Age of Ultron, and then it finally started kind of going in their favor with Winter Soldier and Civil War, where they really started bringing in these ideological values with someone like Captain America, who, guess what, has similarities to Superman. Yeah. And they never maybe quite dug as deep, but they were all the better for trying. And I think some of that influence can be led back to Man of Steel, because before that, I mean, other than the Dark Knight trilogy, what other ones were there? I really miss that era of experimentation, like 2012 to like 2017, where comic book movies were truly being defined before they became much more noisy than they are now. They were really trying different genres, different things, like Guardians of the Galaxy.
I wish, just speaking of, I wish Zack Snyder's Watchmen would have been released later on.
It should be released now. It would be played so differently.
Yeah, I mean, because it did not do well at the box office, but I think had it been released more during kind of the now or the experimentation phase where different styles of comic book movies were really being explored more, I think the movie would have done better. But I mean, Watchmen, we don't have time to get into how influential that was and how much of a trailblazing kind of movie that was, which Christopher Nolan also says. Whenever anybody criticizes Zack Snyder, it's total gaslighting to such an extent, and I fully admit it. But when people mention or criticize Zack Snyder, I just go, well, Christopher Nolan says, and so then that puts people in kind of this awkward position of criticizing Christopher Nolan, which is hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. And it's all in good fun.
And we
It's
also
all good
have,
fun.
and we also have, James Cameron, saying he was inspired by
Yeah.
Zack Snyder, so it's like, I love doing what you said, bringing out those
it's
two
just
names,
total.
and it just like
Yeah,
shuts the
it's not really
conversation down.
gaslighting. It's just like total playful name dropping. Like it's just like, oh, you want to play this game? I'm gonna mention Nolan and Cameron and you got to kind of and the reason, honestly, just the reason why I even mentioned Nolan and Cameron is and their praises of Zack Snyder is because I hope people will at least pull up Google and go, oh, what did Nolan and Cameron say about Zack Snyder? I really respect those guys as a filmmaker. Let me go see what they say, and maybe I'll be able to look at Zack Snyder a little bit differently. If I take into account what titans of the industry like Nolan and Cameron
And
say.
filmmakers like him and like Ryan Johnson, who like you say the name and it splits the room. What better legacy could they ask to have than to be like artistically dividing people? They want their films talked about, and they will be forever because of the decisions they made. Yeah, maybe some studios see them as like not safe choices for things, but largely because of their choices on these divisive films, they've both gotten to charter the creative path forward that they wanted after some hardship. And I just think the best kinds of filmmakers are the ones who start these conversations. And Man of Steel, in my opinion, it's very close with BVS, but in my opinion, it's Zack Snyder's best. And it's him with the best kind of creative choices around him at his best impulses with one of the best characters ever made. And Man of Steel is just a special, special film for all of that.
Yeah, that's a great conclusion.
I think that's a fantastic conclusion. And, and as we close, I would encourage our listeners, because I know not everybody is a fan, of Man of Steel, but kind of going back to what Curry said, I would encourage you all to, revisit it, take a look at it and, and embrace the idea that even if you are not a complete fan of a property or a film or a filmmaker in that sense, that you can still maybe not particularly like it, but you can appreciate it. That there's a lot of films that I will say I don't personally like, but I can actually appreciate the filmmaking. I am not a fan of The Last Jedi. That being said, I can absolutely appreciate what the film did. I can appreciate its filmmaking. I can appreciate its film, maker, well, maybe not having those personal likes that other people have. So I would encourage, people to revisit Man of Steel. If maybe your opinions before were not the most positive about it, and maybe see what you think about it, and see if maybe some appreciation grows from a rewatch of that.
Yeah. And then watch, BVS and Wonder Woman and Zack Snyder's Justice League, and then the DCU ends.
Come on. See, that's what I'm excited about, for y'all to see.
No. I do have a few blinds, but there are a few DCEU movies I have not seen. Not many, but a few of them. But I'm only joking, guys, too. I just say that I just really like the tight kind of story that's told between Man of Steel, BVS, Wonder Woman, and Zack Snyder's Justice League. Those four films, to me, if I was going to choose to preserve anything from the DCEU and I was just forced to do so, it would be those four movies. Plus, if I was given a fifth, the first Aquaman movie. So, and that would be my DCEU. Those five movies would be my DCEU.
It'll be fun to see you when we rank them all at the end and see where we all land. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
It's gonna be a lot of fun. Yeah.
Byron, on that note, should we close with my theme song again?
Yeah, hit it, Curry.
Imagine DCE, you and me, how happy we could be if they just finish it. So happy with Snyder.
And on that note, the first episode of the DCEU and Me podcast concludes. I really hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope that you share it on your social media and with your friends. This is going to be a podcast that follows the entire cinematic universe of the DCEU. We're going to go through each movie, and also too, there is going to be a few surprises in there. We're going to have a bonus movie that you might not expect expect that we're going to go through. And also, you never know what special guests might show up, on particular episodes. So, definitely keep your eye out on that RSS feed, and make sure you like and subscribe, and follow us on social media.